Hello, everybody. I'm Luke Menzel, CEO of the Energy Efficiency Council here in Melbourne, Australia. I'm your chair for this session, and it's my great pleasure to welcome the many people dialing in from Australia and around the world to discuss a really important topic: minimum energy performance standards in buildings, particularly in rental properties. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm hosting this session from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I also want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the many lands on which the speakers and attendees at this webinar live and work. The Energy Efficiency Council is a membership association for businesses, universities, governments and NGOs focused on unlocking the potential of energy efficiency, energy management and demand response in the broader energy transition. We brought together this webinar in response to two really fantastic new pieces of research on the topic of minimum standards in buildings, one from US expert Adam Hinge, another from Louise Sunderland from the Regulatory Assistance Project in Europe. We're excited to hear from Adam and Louise, and also from two Aussie experts, Stanford, Harrison, and from the Commonwealth Government, and Katrina Woolfe from the Victorian Government, to give an update on Australia's progress on this crucial topic. We're also going to hear from everyone over the next 90 minutes or so, but starting with presentations from our two global experts, and we'll be chatting to our presenters along the way. So if you have a question, be sure to pop it in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and I'll do my best to get to it. So let's get into it. First up, we're going to hear from Adam Hinge from Sustainable Energy Partnerships, a New York-based consultancy providing energy efficiency program and policy advisory services to governments, large energy consumers and suppliers, and multilateral organisations around the world. Adam is a fellow of ASHRAE, a board chair-elect of the Institute for Market Transformation, and previously served as an adjunct associate professor at Columbia University's Graduate School of International and Public Affairs. Welcome, Adam.
Thanks very much, Luke. Let's see here. I guess we're all on now. Do you have, just checking that the audio and video are working well, is everyone?
Audio and video working perfectly, Adam. We can hear you loud and clear, and your presentation is now up on the screen.
Excellent. Thanks, everyone, and glad to join you. A message that it was muted. Is it clear now?
Yeah, we've got you again, Adam. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. I don't know what happened there. Anyway, glad to join you early morning Australia time, later afternoon here in New York, and appreciate Louise Sunderland staying up a little later in the evening in Europe. But the report that I'll be speaking about is something that Stanford Harrison's group had commissioned me to do, looking at policies and minimum energy standards for rented properties in an international review. And this really follows a series of reports that I've done for Stanford and his team over the last, I guess, 7 or 8 years. Up until now, all of these have been kind of branded through the International Partnership for Energy Efficiency Cooperation, an organization based in Paris that really had been set up to encourage and get more activity and collaboration activities on energy efficiency policies between the larger economies. And that is in the midst of some organizational changes right now that Stanford may be able to chat just briefly about later. But some previous reports in this series have been looking at definitions and policies for zero energy buildings around the world, existing building energy renovation policies, and last year we had done one looking at the building energy performance gap. So as I said, this is a part of a series that we've had where we kind of look at what are some of the leading policy activities around the world at national levels, and in some cases at subnational levels. And that's kind of been a resource both for Australia for domestic policy use, as well as other countries that are part of the IPEC process. Why don't we move on to the next slide, please? So the purpose of this project was to look at the variety of regulatory policies aimed toward rented properties, and particularly look at minimum energy standards. And I think the theme for the webinar today is looking at performance standards for buildings. I think there are different terms of art. Minimum energy performance standards is much more widely used in Europe. We've been using in the US more a building energy performance standards, or sometimes now as an evolution toward carbon as the metric, building performance standards to not specify energy. But we looked at, kind of did a desk review and a lot of interviews with some experts and policymakers around the world, and found that the policies could kind of be broken down into three main baskets: what we're calling performance standards, prescriptive standards, and then minimum housing quality standards. And you can see in the table here from the report, and we will have the link for the report on the last slide, and I think it may be in the chat box now. All of these policies that are listed here, we have more details of kind of case studies, and in particular for some of the Australian, or for some of the European policies, Louise will talk in a bit more detail to them in a little while. You can see here that most of the activity in the US has been at the subnational level. I think that's where we see most of our leading energy efficiency and environmental policy happening at the US level, and a variety of different things from different member states in the European Union, and growing amount in Australia, New Zealand, and Katrina will tell us more in a little bit about the work that she's doing in Victoria. Next slide, please. Why rented properties? There's a large portion of buildings. Some of the research we found, anywhere 30 to 40% in some jurisdictions are rented properties, and the buildings are occupied or used by people other than the owner. And I think one of the significant issues that is driving some of the policies, and particularly the minimum housing quality standards, is some of these rental buildings often house a large portion of lower income residents with serious housing quality issues. And there are a lot of health issues, from poor indoor air quality, poor comfort conditioning, and a variety of different things that can impact the life and well-being of the people occupying the building. So these policies are trying to address that. There's a major challenge with split incentive, where generally a building owner would need to make the incentive, but a tenant may see some of the benefits of energy savings. And I think we'll talk more later, but the current mix of policies has not driven the desired change. So we need to figure out how we go beyond that. Next slide. The first basket of policies is what we call performance standards. As I said earlier, kind of minimum energy performance standards, which is the term of art that is often used for products. Product and appliance efficiency standards are MAPs in much of the world. But these are focusing on looking at the building's overall energy efficiency or carbon performance, with substantial penalties if the minimum performance is not met, and penalties in lots of different ways. This is often tied to some sort of an energy rating. We'll see more in the European examples in a bit, that it's the Energy Performance Certificate, or EPCs generally. The pilots that are being tested, or not pilots, but the new programs and policies in the US have a variety of different metrics. From in New York, we have something of basically a raw unadjusted greenhouse gas intensity per floor area, whereas other jurisdictions have looked at something based on an energy rating. We have the Energy Star buildings rating system that's been developed by the US Environmental Protection Agency, that gives buildings a 1 to 100 rating, and you kind of need to have your improvements tied with that. These performance standards are more generally applied to large buildings, often commercial office buildings or large multifamily buildings, but have also been applied in several of the European jurisdictions. And then just the list of the examples here on the bottom. Next slide. The next is prescriptive standards. I would say these were probably the earliest standards, and I think this fits as well with how building energy codes and standards have developed for new construction and major renovation, where there is a certain kind of efficiency level for building components. Heating or cooling system efficiency, insulation levels for walls or roofs, window performance, that sort of thing. But it's a series of prescriptive standards that require that these levels be brought up to a minimum level, often triggered at a time of a new tenant move-in or the sale of a property. And these as well, when I talked about the performance standards often being for larger buildings, the prescriptive standards have applied more to residential buildings. I would say this particular basket is something that had been in place in older policies from the early to mid 1980s in these U.S. jurisdictions, and those jurisdictions are trying to move toward a broader, more comprehensive policy now. Next one, please. The last category that we had is minimum housing quality standards. We actually tried to figure out the best terminology for this. I think early on we were calling it minimum appliance and utility standards, something like that. But this is trying to get at the concerns that I'd mentioned of poor housing quality, particularly for some lower income and disadvantaged communities, and get at social equity issues. And generally it's part of a broader type of housing quality aimed at improving the low quality rental housing to get to some minimum consistent quality level. I think this is an area that's been growing. There are some jurisdictions in the US. In Europe, I think we didn't see as much of this, in part because there's a much more established social housing policy and social housing systems in many of the European countries, and some of the provision of comfort conditions like heating are often done through a district heating system in Europe, which isn't applicable in a lot of the other jurisdictions. Next slide. So we tried to kind of pull these together into a summary of what are the benefits and what are some of the challenges with these. I think the main benefits of the performance standards. It provides flexibility. You're not telling the owners exactly what they need to do, but you tell them, here's the target that you have to get to, and then you use your most cost-effective package to get there. And that, I think, with having either an energy performance certificate or some relatively easy to check metric, it's potentially easier compliance checking enforcement. Though I will say, and we'll come back to it in just a bit, that a lot of these policies are new. So compliance checking and enforcement in many cases is either just getting underway or even a couple of years into the future. I think the challenges on these, and actually just before getting on this webinar, I was on an hour-and-a-half call. We're trying to finalize the legislation that was passed in New York City. Has a metric, as I said, of unadjusted carbon per unit of floor area. But some stakeholders argue that that isn't really fair for different kinds of buildings and different uses of buildings like offices. So how do you get to what is accurately assessing and what's a fair measure is a challenge. And I think the low real estate value may have significant challenges, particularly with a lot of the COVID economic situation. Certain building types are going to be struggling financially in the next few years, and that can be challenging. The prescriptive, as I said, I think that is something that were the earlier policies. And I think that what we list as the challenge here, the prescribed measures not be moving the needle, that is really one of the reasons people are trying to move more toward performance and the housing quality standards. On the housing quality standards, I think it's trying to get to a minimum level of conditions that are consistent everywhere. And really the big driver, improving tenant health and comfort. It's not clear whether this is necessarily maximizing the energy or carbon savings. And I think the one at the bottom of could result in increased energy use from new equipment and services. In some cases, you're adding more heating and cooling equipment and conditioning a good deal more space than might have been the situation to start. And that, I think, is important as a way of improving the social well-being of the housing, but won't necessarily result in a significant energy drop. Next slide. As I said, the new international growth and performance standards, Louise will talk a bit more, and some of what we had in this new report was based on two very recent reports, one that Louise will talk about on minimum performance standards for European buildings. And then I had co-authored a paper with the white paper with the executive director of the American Council for Energy Efficient Economy on mandatory building performance standards, where we looked at activities around the globe. The one piece I'll point out here, you can see that most of these policies that we had in the report were enacted fairly recently. And the large portion of them, the majority, I guess, have not yet come into effect for the first compliance date, such that we have a lot to learn yet on what the impacts will actually be. But because of the level of interest, I think we will see growth here. Next slide. What seems to be working? I think one of the pieces, if those of you that are interested enough to want to read the full report, I encourage you to do that. But we do state that for a lot of these programs, it's relatively early days. Implementation and administration of the policies is more just getting underway. But starting with a clear goal. Is it carbon reduction? Is it housing quality improvement? And perhaps those at times could be in conflict, but from a social policy perspective and from general improvement of living conditions, both are critically important. I think the second one on thoughtful timelines here, in some cases there will be quite significant investment needed. The way some of the policies have been set, you need to do quite a dramatic reduction in the energy consumption or the carbon emissions. And in order to get to that, you need some adequate lead time to prepare the market, to build into capital planning cycles with equipment replacements and all of that. It isn't something you can necessarily just say this takes effect tomorrow and assume that there will be compliance. Kind of along with that, there's a need for a good amount of technical support and financing and incentives to help particularly certain types of building owners get to the required performance levels. Next slide. Challenges, as I already said, we're kind of early days. The compliance and impacts are not yet certain. And with a number of the international survey reports I've done for IPEAC over the years, I think this is kind of a recurring theme, and probably need to revisit this 3 to 5 years down the road to see how things are going. Another challenge, exemptions, trying to be really careful about, sometimes exemptions are put in to be able to have something politically palatable for passing legislation or approving regulations, but it can weaken the policy intent without a lot of care. And it will take some time before the measured impacts of many of these are known. And I think that moves on then to the last slide, where we have a couple of minutes for questions, I believe. Oh, sorry, there was one more. I apologize there, but yeah, these were some of our concluding thoughts. Early days, the market signaling, and I think Louise will talk a bit more to this as some of what's going on in the Netherlands with her case study there. Extensive stakeholder outreach, both during the planning of the policies and then during implementation, and then the other pieces I've already mentioned. So, Luke,
Thank you,
get
Adam.
to the last slide.
There you go. And there is the full report. And I understand my colleague Kate has been sharing links in the chat. If you're interested in clicking through, you can do that as well. Adam, just a quick question before we move on to Louise's presentation. The clear evidence is that this is an area of intense interest from policymakers right around the world. And you've pointed to some of the reasons that have been motivating action, whether it's interest in cost-effective carbon reductions or improving amenity for disadvantaged groups. Are the reasons that are driving this kind of policy making and innovation, are they really diverse, or is there kind of a theme that weaves it all together and explains why all this activity is happening over the last decade or so?
I think probably the biggest driver, Luke, is a recognition that there's a lot of potential in the building space for carbon reductions, and we're not seeing the level of reductions that people think are technically and economically feasible, so that we need to look at all the various policy instruments to sort out how we might be able to get going faster on that. I remember Louise and my colleague, co-author Steve Nadell, and I, in finalizing our reports in June, were passing things back and forth, and it kind of seemed like building performance standards were flavor of the month, and I think there's just growing interest. I think the biggest driver is the fact that we need to accelerate the action. There's complete recognition of that. I think there's a sense that the performance standards have the potential, at least, to have some pretty significant and perhaps more quick improvement to existing buildings, where a lot of the opportunity is, and it is driving on actual measured performance in many cases, instead of predictions that some of the other policies are based on. the other piece I'd say, I think a lot of these are starting, at least in the US and some other places, at a local level where policy initiatives can be launched more quickly. And I think that's some of what you're seeing in Australia as well.
Well, thank you, Adam. We're gonna return to you, but I might segue seamlessly to our next presenter, who is Louise Sunderland, Senior Advisor at the Regulatory Assistance Project, or RAP, an independent not-for-profit that provides research and expert advice to energy and environmental policymakers and regulators in Europe, the USA, India, and China. Louise's work focuses on energy efficiency, particularly in the building sector, and on energy poverty. Louise is also an external expert for the European Commission and has served as an expert witness to provide evidence to the United Kingdom's House of Lords. Louise is going to take us through her recent work on minimum energy performance standards for existing buildings, and particularly their role in Europe's decarbonisation goals. Welcome, Louise.
Thanks so much, Luke. Yes, and also thanks to Adam for a brilliant cant around the world, an overview of all of the different standards and drawing together there sort of the learning. If we go on to the next slide, please. So yes, Adam also presented the fact that I've been doing a lot of actually quite similar work to the work he's been involved in, looking around the world, learning from the experience that's out there, really to respond to quite a significant need and interest in these policies in Europe at the moment. So I'm just going to quickly focus on the top right hand of this diagram. If we could go on to the next slide, please. Which is the policies that we have in Europe. We call them minimum energy performance standards, as Adam outlined, so that's the terminology I'll be using. But really, we're talking about the same family of policies, whatever word we use for them. And as I say, in Europe, we have quite a range of standards in existence already. Most of them are performance-based standards, and that's largely, I think, because in Europe, of course, we have the regime of energy performance certificates, which has been rolled out amongst all the member states now over the last sort of 10 years. So it sort of is the obvious tool, I think, in a lot of ways to turn to that member states have used when designing these standards. So we have performance-based standards in England and Wales, separately in Scotland, in France and the Netherlands. We do also have the prescriptive standards. So there are a couple of standards in the Netherlands, in Belgium. The first one that Adam had already mentioned is in Flanders, and that's a standard for minimum insulation and glazing measures, part of a wider housing quality standard. The other standard in Belgium that actually is worth mentioning because it is proposed, it hasn't been introduced yet, but it is worth mentioning because I think it's an interesting kind of crossover standard. It's a measures-based standard, but it's based on the EPC. So in the EPC, we not only have the label for the building, the A to G label for the performance of the building, but we also have recommendations of the measures that would need to be taken, the insulation measures, the heating and power measures to improve that home. So their standard is actually based on fulfilling those recommendations at different 5-yearly intervals. So it's quite an interesting evolution, I think, that perhaps Adam might struggle to put on one or other of the boxes. But it would probably be a prescriptive standard. So we see huge variation in the standards just across Europe. So we see different sectors of the stock addressed, from rented to privately owned to homes to offices. And I think a lot of the differences in these standards really illustrate how they respond to the local priorities. So we have standards that have been introduced to respond to the issue of the split incentive between landlord and tenant that Adam identified, and obviously the standards in Flanders and the UK that address the privately rented buildings are introduced there. Also interesting to note that in Belgium and the UK, we have the oldest and the most inefficient stock. So it's very interesting to see both of those countries are turning to these kinds of policies to really address this very, very poorly performing stock. We have a standard that just goes for the big hitters in terms of energy and carbon savings. So then we have a standard in the Netherlands that addresses offices as fairly high energy using buildings. And we also have standards that address the growing concern of energy poverty in Europe. So the standards in France and in the UK that address the worst performing homes are really, really driven. Certainly I can say this from the UK, having been part of the experience of bringing that standard in, very much driven by concerns about energy poverty. So you can see there's lots of standards, all kind of driven by different objectives and doing slightly different things. Next slide, please. But I'd just like to focus on 3 standards. They're quite different, which is why I'll focus on these 3, and I think they each teach us something slightly different. So the first standard is this prescriptive standard in Flanders. It requires a minimum level of roof insulation and double glazing to be installed as part of this wider housing quality standard. It's an interesting one because it is a housing quality standard. It applies to all houses, but it's only enforced in rental homes. And so it has become known as a rental home standard. And I think that just very simply teaches us that, you know, any standard is really only as good as its enforcement. There is no trigger point at which an owner-occupier would need to comply with this housing quality standard. So it is an unenforced standard. Moving on to the Netherlands, we have, you know, quite an ambitious standard actually for all offices to be EPC C on this ATG rating by 2023. And perhaps one of the reasons that the Netherlands can feel quite so ambitious and setting quite a high standard is that they do have quite a lot of experience with using this kind of policy. So this standard for offices follows voluntary standards that have been delivered in social housing and private rented housing. The Netherlands has put in place quite a good framework of financial and practical support to help building owners to comply with the standard, which is, you know, something that Adam's already identified as really important. And I think what we're observing in the Netherlands is really interesting, is that this standard for offices was announced in 2018. And already since 2018, so well in advance of this enforcement deadline in 2023, we're actually seeing quite a lot of movement and changes in the behaviours of the major Dutch banks that lend to office buildings. And what we're seeing is that they are now not really wanting to lend on properties that don't meet the future standard, and they are supporting their borrowers to put in place plans to improve their buildings to comply with the standard even before the enforcement comes in. So I think this one really teaches us that the early announcement and clear communication of these standards can really ensure that the supply chains and the other enablers align and support compliance and get some of the activity in renovating buildings that we want to see well in advance of compliance. And the final one I just want to briefly describe is the standard for in England and Wales. And this is a rather less ambitious standard at the moment of EPC E. That applies to all rented properties. So it is fully enforced this year for homes and will be fully enforced in 2023 for non-domestic buildings. The reason I say it's fairly unambitious is to put the EPC E standard in context. The average stock standard in homes in England and Wales is D. So you can see that this is actually aiming for a standard that's below average for the stock. It's interesting also to note that this energy performance standard has evolved out of a much older housing performance standard, housing quality standard. But it is actually held back by, I think, its lack of ambition and also by its complexity. So not only is it a relatively unambitious standard, but it's one that's very complex in the way it's been written into regulation. So picking up on Adam's point about kind of exemptions, there's a lot of exemptions that landlords can apply. There's also a cost cap on the cost of measures to comply with the standard that's quite low, actually calculated that about only 50% of the buildings that need to be raised up to this standard could be raised up to this standard, improved to this standard within the cost cap. So lots and lots of kind of exemptions and caveats in this standard that make it quite difficult to enforce and reduce its impact. And also, I think very importantly, that we haven't seen really enough resourcing at local authority level to ensure compliance with the standard, which is, I think, a real challenge with this. So I think the England and Wales standards really teaches us that the standards do need to be simple and easy to understand in order to to be effective. Next slide, please. So then a summary of what we've learned, and a lot of this I think very much confirms what Adam was saying earlier, is that the policy signaling impact of these minimum standards really can shift markets. So obviously they are regulatory standards, they are backstops by nature, but actually when communicated early and clearly, we can see a lot of activity being created well in advance of compliance, which I think is a real strength. We are also seeing some evidence some very early evidence of improved target stock. So this is in the policies, in the standards that have come to maturity, the older standards. In particular, I'm thinking about the Dutch standard for the social housing stock. It's a very ambitious standard of EPC B that actually its compliance date, it comes to maturity this year. It's not only quite an ambitious standard as in being EPC B, quite an ambitious performance standard, but also it covers a large proportion of the stock. So social housing is around 2 million homes. It's about 30% of the housing in the Netherlands. So it's a big standard applying to a lot of buildings. And actually we are seeing that although the social housing stock won't necessarily meet that standard this year, it is on track to meet it next year. So just 1 year after the compliance deadline. So I think that does illustrate that there is a lot of potential in these tools, these standards to really drive the change that we're kind of looking for. Just to repeat again, that I think the complexity of standards, as we've seen in England and Wales, really does inhibit compliance and also inhibits this kind of early policy signalling impact that I think we really want to be seeking. And then the final point that I think is really important for us to explore much more is this kind of hand-in-glove relationship between enabling and enforcement that needs to happen at the local level. I think when looking around a lot of the international standards, I found that almost universally compliance is placed at the local level, whether that be city or local authority. And therefore, I think local authorities really do have this kind of key role in raising awareness of the standard, directing the support to the buildings and the homeowners that they need it most. And I'm thinking very much low-income households in particular there, so directing support where it's needed, but also then following up, making use of data, making use of the other tools that they have to ensure compliance. So they're the kind of headline lessons, very much in line obviously with the other points that Adam made around timelines and the need for supporting programs. Next slide, please. And so that was sort of looking back and looking at the state of play now. I just want to end by sharing some kind of really exciting and important news, I think, from Europe around evidence of the confidence in these kinds of standards to drive the change that we need now. And I think really kind of evidence that it really is sort of time now to regulate for improved performance in buildings. So the first piece of evidence, I think, is the extension of existing standards. And then the second is new proposals for the European Commission to expand minimum energy performance standards across the whole of Europe. Next slide, please. So first of all, that's not the next slide, but I'll keep going. First of all, on the, thank you, that's the one, thank you. First of all, on the extension of the existing standards, where standards are in place, we're seeing them applied to new sectors, sometimes even before we're really seeing the impact of the existing standard. And there I'm thinking of Scotland, for example, that has a standard that applies to privately rented homes. It's now consulting on a new standard for owner-occupied homes. We're also seeing new jurisdictions being brought under standards and higher standards being applied, more ambitious standards. So that very ambitious, unambitious standard that I talked about in England and Wales, we have 2 separate consultations out, proposals from the government to increase that ambition from EPC-E right up to EPC-C for domestic buildings and EPC-B for non-domestic buildings. So quite big kind of votes of confidence, I think, in the potential of these standards, this family of policies. Next slide, please. And then the real kind of hot off the press news from Europe is just 2 weeks ago, the European Commission launched its 10-year renovation strategy. And the aim of that strategy is to double renovation activity in this 10-year period across Europe. And that is very much driven by the aim of the European Green Deal, which is to create a carbon neutral economy across Europe by 2050. 2050, and the realization that without addressing our existing building stock, we cannot achieve that, and that activity and the progress to date has been far too slow. So this was a real kind of point in time strategy to really boost the renovation. Next slide, please. And a real central measure in that strategy is mandatory minimum energy performance standards to be introduced across Europe. This is obviously a strategy at this stage, but the Commission has committed to introduce this into legislation by the end of next year. Next slide, please. So we have this big challenge in Europe. Sorry, one back from that. One big challenge in Europe at the moment, which is there is another slide somewhere. The big challenge in Europe at the moment, I suppose, is that we have this huge aim now of designing a standard that's ambitious across the whole of Europe, that really drives the change that we need and that the renovation strategy requires. So creating a flexible framework that is ambitious enough, but also then allows member states to do what they have been doing, which is to design their minimum energy performance standards that are locally relevant, they're in line with their different types of building stocks, and in line with kind of local priorities and decarbonisation pathways. So this is the big challenge for us in Europe at the moment, and I'm really interested in the rest of this discussion to find out any insights that will be helpful to us with that challenge. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Louise. That was a fascinating presentation. I might bring Adam back into the conversation if you're floating in the background there, Adam, so we can all have a chat together. But while we're waiting for Adam, Louise, there's a question in the chat around the politics of minimum standards, and it's a point that both of you touched on, is that there can be pressure to create these exemptions, which can reduce the efficacy of the policy. Our questioner is asking where that resistance is coming from and how that dynamic is playing out in different jurisdictions. So I'd like to ask that, but I'd also like you to address the flip side of that, which is, I suppose, what are the most effective ways that different jurisdictions and stakeholders are building support for standards as well? Because obviously, well communicated, the community can understand the incredible benefits of some of these consumer protection measures. I might go to you first, Louise.
Yes, it's a really good point. I suppose universally we don't generally like to be regulated, and these standards really are regulations. So I think there is quite often a kind of natural cautiousness about being forced to do anything, but also around how the standard is going to be designed in order to be suitable for all building classes, all building types, and all the different kind of ownership structures that we have. So I think that's in a lot of ways that kind of pushback is quite natural. Certainly in the UK, interestingly enough, I'm going back 10 years now when we introduced the original legislation in the UK. We had a lot of these conversations, and actually just through very simple kind of consultation, coalition building, discussing with, tenant representative groups, landlord representative groups, and figuring out, what people's concerns were and how the policies may, address those. It's just good policy design, really, isn't it? It's nothing kind of more than kind of sensible policy design. And I think, certainly in the UK, I think the most influential and important messaging was the energy poverty message, which was that, very poorly performing homes are, really fundamentally connected as a cause of energy poverty. And we do see low-income households living, much more disproportionately in low-income households. So, it really was a real driver, that could bring a message that could bring everyone together, I think. And I think now what we're seeing is the climate message is actually nearly as strong now. It is forming a much more of a kind of coalition of support around that climate message. There is more understanding that we all need to do our bit. How to build that support? I think it's consultation. I think it's allowing and ensuring every stakeholder has their input into the design of the policy. I would just say, I think the other strength of this policy is that it does, if communicated correctly, and I think this is a real key point to ensure that stakeholders, understand the benefit of it, is that if communicated directly, it does allow a building owner to have foresight, to have the future trajectory in mind, to know the responsibility their building is going to have to comply in the future, and therefore plan the investments within the life cycle stages of the building that are most sensible to them. So I think in a lot of ways they sort of avoid any nasty surprises for building owners.
Which I guess goes, Adam, to your points around appropriate timelines for implementation. But to our questioner's point around where the resistance is coming from, but also where some of the opportunities are in terms of building coalitions. Did you want to comment on that, Adam?
I think, from some of the policy development I've been involved with in the States, particularly in some of the larger cities, every city and every government has important constituencies that can be the squeaky wheel, if you will, or get a little more attention. In the New York policy development, there were some things going on with rent-regulated housing that kind of made a special carve-out exemption of something a little looser for them. And then there were also some real concerns from hospitals and actually religious institutions that some of the policies would be extremely costly and they have no capital available for them. Mm. So there were some processes that were set out that in New York, the politics are such right now that large real estate was not listened to the way some of the other social constituencies were. I think that the pendulum always swings on some of these sorts of things, but I think stakeholder consultation in all of this is critical. I do a lot of work with C40 cities and a group based in the US, the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance. And I think, stakeholder engagement on all of these things is really a critical part of the process. And, perhaps that's something that Katrina and Stanford can talk to in a little bit when they talk about how they're considering and evolving their policy development.
So you've both mentioned the timeline and providing those clear signals to the market about where things are going, but giving time for the market to adjust is another element of, I guess, the policy toolkit that we can utilise in that intervening period. Is some of these complementary or enabling mechanisms, the supports for landlords that want to do the right thing, that can see where the market's going. And we can kind of give them some encouragement to act quickly and some support along the way to get their buildings up to scratch. Is that a sensible approach? And maybe first to you, Adam, on this one, is that something that you're seeing some jurisdictions doing?
Yeah, I think the more you can do of kind of starting to build the capacity and the interest and demonstrate what can be done is great. Sometimes that's done with only having the requirements apply to the largest buildings as a starting point, or have governments lead by example, or some other public or social housing initiatives where if it's not a major capital constraint, maybe government can lead by example with a longer investment window. And I think just in terms of administration and enforcement, being able to build the capacity for that somewhat argues for a smaller number of buildings that might have the provisions apply in the first year or two so that you can build the capacity.
Louise, did you have anything to add on that?
No, really good points from Adam, and I think I'll make perhaps more the more obvious points, but really I think incredibly important to take away, which is that a regulation on its own is fraught with difficulties, both in introducing it, but also in ensuring compliance. And so it really does need to come hand in hand with the funding and finance that's suitable for all of the different building types and the building owners and tenants and landlords. And so a really good kind of framework of suitable funding and finance, as well as the kind of practical technical support and advice to advise how to achieve the renovation that you want to achieve in the right way, with the right measures first. And I think, for me, that really points to, as I say, this kind of local capacity. So I think, very often regulation, and it's sort of the silver bullet, seen as the silver bullet. And I think in Europe, we are at that point now. We're kind of ready to regulate, because we've had a lot of information measures, a lot of incentives, a lot of kind of other awareness raising measures, and we need the backstop now. But I think you can't have the backstop without having all those other things as well in place.
Luke, one other thing I just like to add that kind of builds on your earlier question. I think that some of these newer policies are trying to go a good deal deeper, and sometimes when you're going deeper, that does require significantly more investment, probably with a longer payback time. And I think that is one of the drivers of having some of these longer lead times. That if somebody's just replaced a boiler or just replaced their windows, trying to require something when they're relatively early in their useful life, how do you then instead kind of build into a building's capital planning cycle?
Well, and that goes, I suppose, too, to something like the European renovation wave, Louise, which is setting out a very long-term sort of framework for where Europe is trying to get to in terms of improvement of building stock, with a clear goal around decarbonisation. And I wonder if you want to unpack that and the interactions between, I suppose, the regulatory approach that we're focused on today, and possibly some of the incentives that are going to be available through the renovation waves, and that leads us into a conversation around green stimulus. There's a lot in there, but do you want to just maybe say what you think is most interesting in this broad space that our webinar participants would be keen to hear?
Yeah, it's a big question. Thanks for that. But I do think, I think just on the funding and finance, and I think very relevant at the moment, obviously with the recovery spending, I do think that even before the recovery package was announced in Europe, I think we have seen a lot more gearing of European funds towards renovation. So I think that's been incredibly important, that the knowledge of the need, and I think the existing building stock is one of the sectors in Europe that hasn't advanced and does need to advance. It's very behind, as I say. So I think we have already seen quite a lot more of gearing of funding and finance. But also, I think one of the reasons that we feel probably a little bit more confident to put in place these kind of longer term regulations is that there is significant recovery spending in Europe at the moment. I think it's 1.85 trillion, 610 billion of which it's about a third will be spent on climate action. And this is significant money. And obviously, I think now in recovery periods when the economies are struggling, is probably not a politically appropriate time to regulate. But I think the knowledge of future trajectory is very important for member states and for individuals to figure out how to use that money, most effectively. And we also know lots of studies now in the UK, in Europe, to say that actually building renovation is the best jobs generator. Yep. So if we are looking at any kind of recovery investment, then building renovations, really should be up there on the top of our lists.
As the executive director of the IEA said at a recent energy efficiency conference, Louise, energy efficiency is a jobs machine, is the way that he put it, which is a rallying call that we've certainly picked up here in Australia. Adam, I almost hesitate to ask, given the time that we're recording this, for those watching this webinar on YouTube later on, we're the day after the US presidential election, or should I say the day after the US presidential election was kicked off, because we still don't actually have a result. I don't want to get into all of that, but I would note that one of the candidates, Vice President Biden, does have policy in this space that it approximates in some way what the ambition that we're seeing in Europe around climate-focused stimulus and quite a big building upgrade program. Adam, do you want to just briefly characterize that?
Yeah, I think there have been some very exciting proposals. I've been involved with some of the development of some of the activity, and we remain hopeful that some of that will be able to get instigated. I think some of you may have seen that, and I believe I saw, Luke, that you have Steve Nadell speaking at your upcoming conference, and he'll probably have more, and more will be resolved by the time of that.
We hope so.
But There is a big green renovation wave planned here as well. Part of the recovery program will have a lot of green elements to it under a Biden administration, if that comes to be. Depending, absent the decision on the administration, much of the funding for all of that depends on what happens with the congressional elections as well. And at least as of when I looked an hour or so before getting online with this, the Senate wasn't looking quite as good as we had expected. So many questions up in the air, a bit more discouraging than what we anticipated a couple of days ago as of right now, but still trying to remain optimistic that that some of that may change. And again, for those of you watching this on a webinar in a week or two, probably more will be known. So I probably didn't answer that question, but it's a little bit of a strange time right now, Luke.
I think we are at an interregnum. I think we can call it that, Adam, and we just all have to be patient and wait for those votes to be counted. I want to get to our other panelists, but I do have one question from a local expert here in Australia, Alan Peers, who was asking you, Adam and Louise, to unpack which performance standards are based on modelling and which are based on actual performance data, as our own neighbours program here is in Australia. And it's quite a long question, but I think I can hopefully characterise it fairly, Alan, by saying, to what degree is actual metering and real-time data starting to be taken into account in some of these standards, and potentially that allowing policymakers to focus on very high consumption buildings because you've got that real-time data. Is that sort of a nascent area? Is there anyone that is actually putting in place meaningful regulations in that space, or is it one to watch? I might go to you first, Louise, from a European perspective, and then Adam.
Well, I think I will defer to Adam on this one, because I think there's probably more experience in the States on this, or at least looking towards this, in part because their standards tend to focus on the bigger buildings. The energy performance certificates in Europe generally, I think, are asset ratings, so don't look at actual building performance, and of course that is a flaw in a lot of ways. On the other hand, from a kind of communication point of view, actually having that label and having that clear comparison is actually quite helpful. So yeah, but I mean, of course, the final aim is to get to actual performance, and that's actual performance and energy reductions and carbon reductions, and that's the goal. But I'm sure Adam can sort of fill in a bit more.
Yeah, to Alan's question, I think there's been a bunch of work looking at what types of policies are based on either the asset or kind of calculated rating versus the operational or measured rating. And I think there's a recognition that there can be a gap, as I mentioned early on. Our International Partnership for Energy Efficiency Cooperation survey report last year was looking at performance gap issues around the world and trying to quantify some of that. There has been some work done, and we can point you to the IPEAC documents that tried to spell out which rating systems around the world were based on the operational actual performance data, like you have with the Australian neighbors and what we have in the US with the Energy Star Buildings program. I think just as a kind of general piece or general reaction, often the larger buildings, I would take Europe as an exception because the asset ratings are much more popular with the energy performance certificates in Europe, but generally larger buildings where I think it's more difficult to do an accurate model will often be an operational rating, whereas homes, and this came through in our performance gap report last year, homes are so dependent on what the occupancy type is. You can have the exact same house that would have one person who's rarely there, or have 6 people who are taking showers all the time. And there's so much more occupancy driven stuff that perhaps, in smaller homes, then the asset rating is more applicable. But that has been quantified some places. And Alan, I think in the slide deck, my email was in there. I can try and point you to some specific references if that would be helpful.
Well, that's a good starting point to a longer conversation, I think, potentially, Alan, if you want to get in touch with Adam. But let's bring in an Australian perspective. At this point, I want to introduce both of our 2 Australian experts, Katrina Woolfe, Manager Residential Energy Efficiency at Victoria's Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, and Stanford Harrison, Manager Commercial Buildings Policy at the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources in the Commonwealth Government. Katrina, if I can start with you, here in Australia, some of our local participants would know we have a trajectory for low energy buildings, which acts as a framework for action from state and federal government. And I understand Victoria is leading on the measure focused on minimum rental standards. Could you tell us a little bit about that work?
Yep, sure. So I'll talk briefly about two projects. So I'll start with the rental framework for energy efficiency in rented homes, and then I'll talk about the minimum rental standards in Victoria. So as the Australians in the webinar probably know, the addendum to the National Trajectory for Low Energy Buildings was approved by energy ministers from Australian jurisdictions back in November 2019. And among the many actions in the addendum was one to look at a national framework for energy efficiency requirements for rented homes. And as you mentioned, Luke, the state of Victoria is coordinating the development of the framework, but will have input from all the other jurisdictions through the national process. And I guess before I go on, and I guess as a bit of an aside to the webinar's international audience, it's important to note that the various states and territories in Australia each have their own legislation that sets out the requirements for leasing homes. And while the trajectory included rental standards as a priority for action, the detailed work to develop and implement those standards rests with individual jurisdictions. So just to give you a bit of a sense of how that works here. While so the intention of the national framework is to help inform consideration by individual jurisdictions of how those minimum standards might be applied within their regulatory processes. The framework will also be informed by work already underway at the individual jurisdictional level and will draw on the practical experience of design and implementation to date. So it'll set out the potential approaches for minimum standards, recognising that its application will be influenced by the particular operating context, the regulatory and other settings of each jurisdiction, and the processes that are already underway. The framework's due for completion mid-2022, and then the next step under the trajectory is that by mid-2023, jurisdictions are to commence processes for considering the implementation of the standards, and the implementation timeframe of mid-2025 was provided in the trajectory, noting that the work will be subject to the regulatory impact statement processes of each jurisdiction. I guess it's also worth noting that the development of the framework will be coordinated with other related components of the trajectory, such as the disclosure framework and the policy work focusing on low income and vulnerable communities. Now I can talk about some of the specific work that's being undertaken in Victoria in relation to the minimum standards for rented homes. So in Victoria, the Residential Tenancies Act 1997, which I'm going to refer to as the RTA from here on in, is administered by the Department of Justice and Community Safety. And essentially the RTA specifies the requirements for renting homes. And it's worth noting that there's already requirements in place under the RTA for water efficiency of shower roses. In effect, that also delivers energy efficiency benefits. You know, as people will be aware, a water efficient shower rose, it will also help in reducing energy use. So back to the RTA. So there were some major amendments to the RTA that were passed late 2018, and these included provision for the introduction of rental minimum standards to improve amenity safety, security and energy efficiency of rental premises in Victoria. I should just add that these new amendments have not yet commenced, but as part of preparing for the implementation for the amendments to the RTA, the Department of Justice and Community Safety has commenced the process of detailed regulation making to define the standards. And late in 2019, a regulatory impact statement was released that included a proposal for a minimum standard for heating in the main living area of rented homes. The regulatory impact statement also flagged future work to investigate additional energy efficiency standards in relation to ceiling insulation and hot water systems. And together, these three elements, so heating and insulation and hot water system, would account for the major proportion of energy costs and impacts on renter comfort. The initial focus for action was on heaters, as the vast majority of energy use in Victorian homes is spent on heating, in fact, more than half. And where heaters are installed, there is currently no requirement for energy efficiency. We recognise that the importance of insulation and draft proofing to comfort and cost, but we did not want to delay action on heating while further work was being done on ensuring safe and effective insulation installation. So starting with heating also allows for landlords to spread the costs of upgrades over time. We also chose to pursue a simple features-based approach, as this provided a relatively quick pathway for implementation and for managing compliance. In particular, existing appliance standards can be referenced. It's also important to be able to clearly communicate to landlords what action was needed and for renters to be able to easily check on whether a property complied with the standard. Our research estimated that over 10% of rented homes do not have a heater installed, and in these homes, renters would either go without heating in winter or would need to purchase a plug-in heater, which provides both poor heating amenity compared to a fixed energy efficient heater, as well as being very costly to operate. The regulatory impact statement set out a proposed minimum standard for fixed heating that must be installed in the main living area when a property is leased. The standard will be phased in over a number of years to minimise cost impact on landlords. Presently, the Department of Justice and Community Safety is considering feedback that's been provided through the consultation process. And I should note the rental reforms were initially due to commence back in July, but due to coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic, the rental reforms are now scheduled to commence on 29th of March 2021. And as to the next steps on rental energy efficiency standards, DELP, our work has commenced preliminary work to identify the current situation with insulation. This includes supporting the Energy Efficiency Council's insulation industry roadmap, which commenced stakeholder consultation last month. That's it for my presentation, and I'll hand back to Luke.
Thank you, Katrina. It's really good to have a really worked study of how these standards are rolling out in Australia, and I guess points to Australia being at a similar point to some of our friends overseas, in that we're at the start of a journey around minimum rental standards, and there's a little bit of careful thinking happening in Victoria as well as around the country about how they could be implemented in the jurisdictions. With Victoria as the lead on this, there's obviously a lot of collaboration happening between states and to some degree coordinated by the federal government. Do you think it's likely that we'll see very different models rolled out in different states around the country, or do you think there's going to be a lot of commonalities? Or there's sort of some emerging consensus on some key characteristics? Noting the different sort of ways of approaching this issue that Adam has pointed to around the world, and different models that jurisdictions could potentially adopt. Do you think it's going to be lots of similarity, or do you expect some divergence?
I think it's a bit too early to tell on that, and we will be starting off with having a look at the different legislation that is in place, just to see what's currently I guess it allows for as part of that legislation, and obviously we will be looking at what sort of data currently exists. I mean, that, you know, for those people who are outside Australia, there's a lot of differences in climatically across the country. So that would also need to be factored in to see how that might impact on that. But yeah, so as I mentioned, the timeline for the delivery of the framework is mid 2022. So there, you know, is definitely time to explore and to determine that you know, how that might play out.
Bit of water to go under the bridge, and
Yes.
given that there is there is this process that will play out. What is if there are people on the call or indeed watching this webinar later that would like to get involved, what's the best way of them engaging with this important work?
Yep. So the DISA in the Commonwealth Government has a stakeholder reference group that apparently has about 800 people on that list. So if you're not one of those 800, definitely I would suggest that you make sure that you're on that mailing list. I don't have the details to hand, but we can pass that on to the Energy Efficiency Council to distribute. So
and we'll certainly
involved.
do that for everybody that's signed up for this webinar,
yes.
and, you know, associated with the video that's ultimately posted. Stanford, can I confirm, is that 800 people that are interested specifically in the topic of rental standards, or are that's 800 that are interested in the trajectory more broadly? Because if it was rental standards, that would be quite remarkable.
It would indeed be remarkable. No, that's the total number of people who are on the stakeholder reference group. Twice a year, there's a mail a telco hookup on that, but I think there's people who are interested in every aspect, and of course the trajectory for low energy buildings covers a whole range of ways to achieve low energy buildings.
Well, we could probably talk for an hour just about the trajectory, but the Commonwealth is responsible for coordinating activity across Australia's states and territories, as well as at the federal level, on this broad ambition to ramp up the energy performance of buildings over coming years. You've been listening to everyone's presentations. What has stood out for you that you'd like to chip in on, having the benefit of coming last in the webinar?
Yes, that's right. No, it's really interesting. It's really interesting for me because we're in many ways in the energy efficiency field. There's a lot of policy tools which have been around for a long time, and there's also a lot more recent developments, and this concept of minimum standards for rental properties is a relatively recent phenomenon, as we've just heard from the presenters, and so and we're aware that there was quite a bit of recent activity, which is why we're sort of we're interested in particularly Adam's work commissioning that sort of, well, what's happening around the world, what actually works, sort of what are the parameters about understanding this development. Of course, it's a policy tool. I should say that just to pick up on Adam's point about the International Partnership for Energy Efficiency Cooperation, that was a body which had a 10-year mandate. It's the process of being handed over to the auspices of the International Energy Agency, the Energy Efficiency Hub, which is in the process of being set up. So in terms of intergovernmental policy cooperation, that's also in an interregnum. So we've, in terms of the hearing what's happening around the world, that's been quite interesting in terms of what's the problem you're trying to fix with using this particular tool, and sort of hearing that distinction between is it energy poverty, is it actually achieving emissions reduction or improving the quality of homes and commercial buildings, and that's. And being clear about the problem that's been trying to be fixed seems to be sort of is obviously part of good policy development. I can see that there's quite a range of approaches been happening in that space. I'm quite interested in the policy signalling issue or the attribute that was, and certainly in my discussions with people in the UK government, aware that in distinguishing the minimum standards, which were flagged for quite some time, I think from 2010, and only brought in quite recently. And the general observation was that the commercial property market had reacted quite early on and were busy sort of upgrading buildings in advance of that date, whereas private landlords, it all took them by surprise. And I gather that the Netherlands, you're flagging some similar outcomes there. And so, different audiences, policy signaling works differently for different audiences. And also that stepwise approach of flagging things in advance, it's clearly very important. I've seen it in so many other areas. Compliance lessons are quite important. Keep it simple, keep it important, keep it an important role for whoever's actually carrying out the compliance, and some sort of line of sight to that. If it's sort of it's job number 99 and 100 priorities for a particular compliance officer, well, then that might affect how actually achieving the effectiveness of results. And the other element is the funding and the finance is important. I mean, if we're talking about improving the standards, improving the buildings, well, it's going to cost money. And it's a case of sort of, well, how do we enable that as well, so as to not make that a major crunch point? And that's hearing the exciting news about the European renovation wave announcement. That's really important in this space, and very much you're really going to watch that with interest. In Australia, with our modelling under the trajectory for low energy buildings, the existing buildings stock was really important in terms of achieving substantial changes in the energy and emissions performance of our building stock, and the rate of renovation which occurs and the degree to which existing standards are applied at that key point of intervention when a renovation is being contemplated anyway. Those sort of things are quite important to understand about the building stock, about sort of what's actually already happening out there, and what actually influences that, the tax treatment of improvements versus just replacement, the sort of price signals which go through that, those sort of regimes. So it's not sort of context independent. You really need to sort of look at sort of what is the whole package. It's not just one intervention. There's a number of parts to this, and like I said, very interested in hearing what happens in the EU and perhaps what happens in North America.
Well, indeed. I might invite Louise and Adam back into the conversation now that we've got our full panel assembled. And while they're coming back online, I'll reflect that you've got obviously the EU's renovation wave. You've got some prospect of activity in the US in some form, depending on the election outcome. But you've also got the United Kingdom, which has committed £3 billion to the broad area of building upgrades, with $2 billion of that allocated to incentives around residential building. So this is a theme that emerged very early in the pandemic, and when there was a recognition that there would be a need for recovery spending. And obviously the International Energy Agency and the International Monetary Fund and others have laid out that case very strongly, and governments around the world are responding. Lots to watch and lots to reflect on here in Australia as we consider our own pathway out of this economic crisis. I want to dig into this theme that's been running through all of these conversations about the potential that some of our goals in this space might be at cross purposes. So you've obviously got the health and amenity elements of it's almost sort of consumer protection elements of minimum rental standards, which are, I think we can't let go of. But you've also got, goals around, carbon reductions, reducing the carbon intensity of buildings. I suppose my question, I might put it to you, Adam, because I think you're the first one to raise this as an issue, and it's a little bit of a theme in your report. Can we afford to give up some of the multiple benefits of energy efficiency, but if I can use that old phrase, or do we simply need to commit ourselves to designing policy which will tick all of those boxes as best we can. Because I'm loath to give up any of those arguments as I have conversations with government and around the usefulness of these standards as we make this transition.
I think the response I'd make, Luke, is trying to have a thoughtful package that balances all of the different drivers. And Katrina's policy, I think housing quality and the moving toward a more consistent level of housing quality and comfort is a critically important equity issue. To leave certain parts of society behind and not have access to the quality of life that others do, I think is a social policy issue that can't be ignored whatsoever. I think there's also obvious imperative for as aggressive climate action as we can take, and I think, and there are also a lot of issues around the States right now, and I suspect in other parts of the world where with COVID concerns, ventilation and bringing in fresh air as much as possible, even though there's an energy cost to that. There are other societal drivers beyond those that we're the most passionate about. Luke, as an energy efficiency advocate, you probably need to keep the laser focus for Stanford and Katrina and others on the energy efficiency pieces, because you have counterparts from the other views that will be making sure that their perspectives aren't ignored. And I think it becomes the challenge both of the regulators as well as effective advocates, working together to try and see how you come up with the optimal package that helps move society forward.
Louise, there in Europe, you've said that perhaps the social equity and the energy poverty piece was driving this initially, but the concerns around carbon have kind of been elevated to almost an equal level. Is that the way you're seeing this moving forward, as kind of an articulation of how those various benefits can be achieved through a package of measures?
Yes, I mean, I think if you look at the way within the remuneration wave, the Commission proposed this measure, the minimum energy performance measure, it was very much in response to one of the three priority areas, and that priority areas was addressing the worst performing buildings and addressing energy poverty. So I think, really in the Commission's mind, those two things are very closely aligned. And I think also in Europe, it's just really evident to us at the moment, the point that Adam just said, we will not have an energy transition unless it's just. Yep. We have experienced the Yellow Vest protests in France that really influence a lot, and I think as I say, that the issue of energy poverty as a very important equity issue is rising up the agenda. So I think in some ways, in a very practical level, I think the fact that a lot of the EPCs are based on asset ratings does kind of put the focus on improving the efficiency and the performance of the building. If the household or building user within that building needs to take that as comfort rather than energy savings, then that's fine. The asset rating kind of still encourages for that improvement. But I mean, I think it's the fundamental point that we need all of these benefits. And actually, I think increasingly, when we need to win hearts and minds, both to introduce these policies successfully, with the political, to make them politically acceptable, but also to deliver the measures and get people to actually take the activities they want them to. We need to use all the benefits that we have up our sleeves. I think increasingly there's a realization that economic benefits, payback period, are not convincing enough. So we need to be talking about, the health and well-being aspects, the jobs so important at the moment, and all the other benefits that we've got. Throw everything at it, I think, is what I'm trying to say.
Kitchen sink approach. So Stanford or Katrina, did you have anything you wanted to chip in on that point? No. Well, I might stay with you, Louise, and obviously energy performance certificates have played a big role in Europe for a while now. It strikes me that what is being contemplated as we head into the 2020s in Europe is a pretty sophisticated sort of set of policies, and I wonder the degree to which just the data that is available in Europe about what's happening in building stock that is being generated by that regime of EPCs is able to inform policymakers and drive a whole suite of other policies, measures, incentives that are very well targeted and based on a whole lot of evidence. Is that a fair kind of connection to draw?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely key. And in fact, it's an interesting point because back in 2016, the Commission released an impact assessment that actually did consider a minimum energy performance standard type measure. And one of the reasons it rejected it back in 2016 was that the Commission didn't feel that there was enough building stock data generated at member state level to proceed on the basis that obviously that member states could design policies that were appropriate, and a lot has moved on in those last 4 years. EPC penetration has increased, and obviously the data that you're referring to, that's being centrally collected, has obviously built up as well there. So I think data is really important. I mean, I would say there is a difference in penetration of EPCs across countries in Europe. So, in some countries like the UK, there's incredible penetration, and therefore the EPC databases and the stock data is incredible. In other countries, it isn't as advanced yet. So I think, there is still work to do, but yes, that data is absolutely essential. And the EPCs, actually, very interestingly, when the EPC was introduced, there was no requirement. There was a requirement for the label to be introduced, but there was actually no requirement on member states to create the databases that sit behind them. But universally, every member state has created one. So it just really shows you that actually the value in the EPC is the things behind the scenes, not necessarily the label that we see, in the marketing information.
And Stanford, I understand that as part of the broader trajectory work, there's some work underway to look at some sort of a voluntary disclosure in the residential space. Do you want to just quickly characterise that work stream, which is, I think, happening in parallel to the rental standards work?
I probably need to. I mean, first I just observed that EPCs in Europe, for all their failings, they're a wonderful source of information, and and obviously an important policy tool. And of course, we don't really have that in Australia, but we do have very good performance-based ratings for some commercial buildings, as you know, with the Neighbours program. But in terms of the rental equivalent, there has been one in the ACT. Jurisdiction for some time, but Katrina, I'll probably hand over to you now to talk about the developments, which I think are being led by Victoria in terms of the residential scorecard.
So people may be aware of the residential efficiency scorecard, which Victoria has developed, and that has been trialled in other jurisdictions to see how that's been applied. So what it is, it's a rating of the energy efficiency or the energy performance of homes, includes a hot weather rating as well. So it provides information to the homeowner and the occupants about how that home performs.
And I understand, Katrina, the intention, and correct me if I'm wrong, Katrina, in Stanford, is to use the scorecard as a starting point for a broader national process to explore how a voluntary rating system could be expanded nationally. Is that correct?
So there's as part of the trajectory, the NatHERS, which is the sort of national scheme for energy rating, has been focused on new builds. That is being looked at for existing buildings, and the scorecards being investigated as part of that. And I can see there's comments popping up from Rachel as well about how the NatHERS team are going to expand the scheme to existing homes. And I noticed she also had made a comment about the disclosure project. So just to confirm, that's being led by the Commonwealth and not Victoria.
Excellent. Okay, so plenty to dig in there, and perhaps Stanford, another reason to join that 800-person teleconference that's happening intermittently. So anyone interested can get a full update on all of that work. Look, I'm conscious of time. We do need to wrap up, but I just want to give all of our panelists a final opportunity for policymakers that are perhaps contemplating rather than being in process at the moment. And while there's been a lot of activity, there'll be an awful lot of jurisdictions around the world that are in contemplation mode and looking for the best way forward. What is the key lesson that they should draw from the activity that's happening around the world? Adam, I might go from you. What would your sort of key piece of advice be for a policymaker that was looking to delve into the wonderful world of minimum rental standards?
Well, I think start with the report that was recently written. We've tried to compile some useful stuff there. I think trying to articulate as carefully as possible the goals, as we've talked about, to make sure that there's clarity, to minimize conflicts. And the other piece that was really interesting just in the discussion in the last 5 or 10 minutes about the value of the energy performance certificates in Europe, I think the activity that's been going on in a lot of the US jurisdictions was able to happen in large part because of earlier performance disclosure and energy audit requirements that gave a tremendous amount of data about building characteristics, equipment, and systems and all of that, and able to link that. So I think the more you can do kind of capacity building with collecting data earlier rather than later makes other policy implementation much easier.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Something we're very interested here at the Energy Efficiency Council is the role of disclosure as kind of an enabling mechanism, which won't sort of it won't solve the world's problems, but it will give you a fantastic platform on which to build policy.
A couple of people I work with refer to it as the infrastructure that you need for other activities to happen.
Okay. Louise, any final thoughts on what policymakers should be thinking about as they contemplate this area?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much has been said already. I think maybe the one point that I took away from doing this work and continue to do this work is the point around if you're choosing which policies to put into your policy package, the minimum energy performance standards can really drive kind of efficient, cost-efficient renovation. And the reason I say that is that I think we're seeing in a number of member states in Europe that actually driving renovation just through increasing incentives, increasingly generous incentives, or on the other hand, increasingly expensive carbon prices, is getting really expensive. And actually we need something else to drive demand. And, I think this very clear signal can mean that, we still need the incentives, we still need the funding and finances we've talked about, but I think we are not going to be in this ever kind of in this world where, we have to give more and more and more to get the laggards to kind of do the work we need them to do. So for me, that's something, a really interesting insight that I think if I was a policymaker putting a framework together, that would be influential.
Well, it's just another piece of evidence that underlines the reality that this broader transition we're working through, you can have, and it's important to have those economy-wide signals, but you also need, especially when it comes to energy efficiency, you need those targeted, tailored policies that address the particular opportunities and barriers in specific sectors. And this is a fantastic opportunity of that. Katrina, I'll let you answer this as you see fit, but like you are working in this policy area, is there something coming out of today's conversation, listening to Louise and Adam that particularly stood out to you?
So one of the things that stood out was around keeping things, like simple and sort of easy to communicate. I mean, in Australia, we have the minimum appliance standards. So we have, star ratings. So, being able to draw on all of those great resources and all the work that's occurred previously, I think, helps to, send a sort of a simpler, message around what that standard is. So, being able to have a look at all those various, sorry, all those, all the resources that exist out there, and bringing all that together, I think is a good way to, start with standards.
A wonderful thought. And Stanford, a final thought from you?
Good. Sorry, just waving my wife goodbye.
That time of day.
Yeah, that's no. Just one thing to add, and that is it also depends on the nature of the rental market, and the rules and practices around rental markets, of course, differ between countries. And of course, in Australia, residential markets, they're relatively short-term leases. The relative balance of power between tenant and landlord is different to what it is in Europe. So so minimum standards for rentals does depend on the nature of the problems which are and the nature of the rental markets which in which they intervene. So just put that point in, that is possibly quite a promising policy tool, to be looked at within the Australian context, and probably many other countries with similar rental markets.
Lots to learn from overseas and the experience of overseas, but as you say, Stanford, it's going to be crucial that interventions are very well targeted to the particular priorities and stakeholders and situations, climactic and otherwise, that exist in various jurisdictions. So, Adam, Louise, Katrina and Stanford, thanks for a fantastic conversation. It has been great to have the benefit of your insights and expertise. And thanks to everyone that joined us online. It's certainly encouraging to see the level of interest global in this topic, as evidenced by participation in this webinar, but also the reports that have been penned by Adam and Louise. If you want to access these reports, you'll find Adam's report on the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources website, and you can track down Louise's work on the Regulatory Assistance Projects site. This webinar will be up shortly on the Energy Efficiency Council's YouTube channel, and of course you can visit the Energy Efficiency Council's website as well, eec.org.au, for our recommendations on how minimum standards can play an important role in saving money and cutting carbon emissions right here in Australia. But for now, it is goodbye from us, and we'll catch you soon.